Welcome everybody back to the channel. My name is Christina. If you are new here, I am a naturopath, nutritionist, life coach, carnivore, all of the different things. And this is where I share some of my knowledge in regards to carnivore as well as health. And it's where I share my own personal experience. So today I'm going to be talking about diabetes. And this is a topic that's really close to my heart because I have grown up in a family where my father had diabetes, and I witnessed what he went through as a child. And if you know anything about my story, one of the things that I've shared about that experience was that when I watched him go through diabetes at 16, so I was 16, he was clearly older. And so I watched him go through that experience. And I remember at that moment in time, in my like childhoodness, you know, how we are when we're in our teens, we think we know everything and how the world's going to run and all of that type of stuff. And so in my childhoodness, I remember watching him go through that and thinking, this is the worst thing ever. I never want to have this experience. I never want to do this. If I get diabetes, I'm just going to kill myself. Like that was kind of the prospect and thoughts that I had about it at the time going through that and watching him go through the journey, because I saw, you know, the challenges and the trauma and the like not support. And like there's this thing in the space of diabetes where the education doesn't actually match what happens in reality. So the education is eat this many carbohydrates and, you know, eat some pasta and this and that and so on. But it's actually not the thing that lowers the glucose levels, because it actually is increasing it. Because often, like I know for myself in my own experience with it, that what they told me to do was actually I ate more carbohydrates than what I was eating before. And that, of course, made my blood glucose increase. So I had this experience with my dad when I watched him go through this to and fro, trying to do the right thing, finding it really difficult, not having the support from family members or understanding even about what it is, but also the education that was there was not appropriate. It was not right. It actually wasn't good information that actually helped people lower their blood glucose. It didn't talk about, you know, it didn't really educate properly. And so I saw him go through this struggle of trying to do the right thing and then having to inject himself with insulin and, you know, this trauma essentially that he went through with this thing. And then, of course, that leads to other things. You know, if you've got diabetes, you're generally going to have high blood pressure. You might have, you know, high cholesterol. And, you know, the cycle of medication becomes huge because, you know, some of those medications create side effects, and then you need to have different medications for those side effects. And the circle just goes on and on and on and on and on. And it's not actually dealing with the root cause of the problem. And so then fast forward to when I had my own pregnancy. So I had my first baby when I was 23, got married at 23. So at 23, I was having my first baby and I got diagnosed with gestational diabetes. And I remember going through that pregnancy, being the person that I am, I needed to figure this out. Like I needed to know the ins and outs so that I could understand what was actually going on for my body, what was happening, how can I help myself, how can I help my baby through this? And doing that research, I went to, because I worked at the university at that point in time. So I went to the university, I got the medical textbooks out, was sitting on the floor, reading as much as I possibly could about this condition, and then trying to look at it from the pediatric perspective of, you know, being pregnant and what that means for my baby and all of that type of stuff and how that all kind of works together. So I was spending days and days just on the library floor reading all of this information. One of the things that I came across was quite eye-opening for me, and it was in the medical textbook, which was that women who take insulin during pregnancy, there is a higher increased rate of stillbirth in those babies in the last 6 weeks of pregnancy. Now, for me, I read that and I went, if that is a risk and I can avoid that risk, why would I not do everything in my power to avoid that risk? Now, I know from the medical perspective, you know, they're monitoring women much more closely during those last 6 weeks. They often cut the pregnancy short by getting people to give birth at 38 weeks instead. And so, you know, they're limiting the amount of time. So then instead of the 6 weeks, it's going to be the 4 weeks if they get those women to have early births. But the roller coaster that comes from that is huge. So, for example, if you induce a woman at 38 weeks, the likelihood is that you're more likely to have a C-section birth than you are a normal vaginal birth. And that's simply because of the processes and the stress that your body goes under at starting a labor not naturally. So when the body's fully developed, the baby's fully developed, all the chemicals and hormones are working the way that they should, and that natural process begins itself, it's less stressful on the body than if we force it to happen by giving them a oxytocin drip and things like that, or oxytocin drip. And so the stress of that then often will lead to more C-sections in those pregnancies, which then also leads to outcomes during, that child's life. Like we know that you get a different microbiome if you're born via a C-section versus born by a vaginal birth. Like there's this whole process that happens as you get squeezed through the birth canal, your lungs get emptied and you get this beautiful coating of a microbiome. And then, go to the breast, and then that colostrum feeds those microbes, and we have a baby that's got a much healthier microbiome than a baby that comes through a C-section. Now, I'm not saying that to say C-sections are terrible and bad. They absolutely save lives. But when we can avoid the risk, isn't it better to avoid the risk than increase that risk? And so that was my thought process when I was, in that first pregnancy with that gestational diabetes, was if this is a risk that I can avoid, I'm going to do everything in my power to avoid it. And then everything that I was reading through that literature was talking to me about it being a carbohydrate problem, that the body is struggling to deal with the amount of carbohydrates that are coming in, that the insulin is not matching the amount of carbohydrates that is being taken in. And so breaking that information down in my mind, I went, well, shouldn't I then be lowering my carbohydrates and reducing those? And so what happened was that I would go to the diabetes education, because they would provide education for women with gestational diabetes. And I'm sitting there, and what the diabetes educator was sharing was not what I was reading, it didn't seem to match. It didn't seem to align. And really, ultimately, when I sat down and thought about what information she was giving us, that information really was actually pushing me in particular, and as well as I'm sure other women in particular, into a pathway of needing to have insulin in that pregnancy instead of reducing our risk of needing to have insulin in the pregnancy. And so from that perspective, I went, this just doesn't make sense to me. And I kind of ignored what they actually had to say. And so from that stance, I went, I've been reading that this is a carbohydrate issue. I'm going to reduce my carbohydrates, and I'm not actually going to abide by their rules. So, their rules were, I think it was something like 150 grams of carbohydrate a day at that point. It might have been something like even 100 grams of carbohydrates for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I can't remember. It was like 20 years ago. So the rules and regulations might have changed from 20 years ago when I first did it. And so I just remember thinking it was a lot, because they were telling me to have like bread for breakfast and cereal and orange juice and for lunch, more carbohydrates. And, this is how many Coca-Colas I could have in a day. And just like, this is ridiculous. Like, are you meant to be teaching me to be healthy for my pregnancy and my baby? This is the opposite of that. And so from that perspective, I then started to look at it differently. And what I did was I cut down all the carbohydrates, and I essentially went to what was fairly close to hypercarnivore at that point in time. I didn't have the name for it. I didn't have the words for it, but it was essentially hypercarnivore. Now that I have those words and now that I have those names, I know that that's what it was. And so when it came to that perspective, my blood glucose came down. When I came to doing those things and actioning those things, my blood glucose came down. And I was on this line of like, you're going to need insulin. And it took me from that place to, looks like you don't need insulin. And so I was medication free for that pregnancy. And so with that in mind, I continued to do that through other pregnancies when I was diagnosed with gestational diabetes. Now, in retrospect, in hindsight, I wish that I'd continued that between the pregnancies, but life being busy and finances being stretched and like lack of sleep and all that sort of stuff meant that I didn't actually do that. I didn't do that in between pregnancies. I just kind of did that in the pregnancies. And that's what actually created the best results. Now, if I could go back again, there would be some things that I would implement as well that would have helped me even further. Now knowing the knowledge that I actually know on this particular topic, there are more things that I would implement that would have helped me. And so I'm going to give you some of the tips that would have helped me further in that pregnancy, but also stepping forward to today. So in 2020, my blood glucose was super high. So my fasting blood glucose was 21.2, which is huge when it comes to what that is. So I was getting close in those numbers in regards to they potentially would have started to consider me a type 1 diabetic. And so I, having all the medical knowledge and stuff that I have from nutrition, etc., didn't want to go down the pathway of being diagnosed. And so I didn't want to go to hospital, which was the other thing that would have been a responsible decision to make. I'm not telling you not to go to hospital or not see your doctor. I'm saying these are decisions that I made for my health, knowing the implications and taking full responsibility for those implications. And so knowing the implications and knowing the risks and knowing what I knew about supporting myself through this process, I made the decision to go carnivore because now I had the language for that. You know, the term carnivore hasn't actually been around forever and a day in the sense of a dietary protocol. And so I'd been hearing a little bit about it. I hadn't really looked into it much yet at all, but I was just kind of like, this kind of sounds a little bit like what I did with those pregnancies. So I was hyper carnivore in those pregnancies. So I mostly ate meat, but I had a little bit of broccoli and I had a little bit of like vegetables here and there. That was mostly what I did. And so it was predominantly meat, but I did have some vegetables. So I might have had a salad, for example, with my meat. And so as I was thinking through, what do I want to do for my health? I don't want to go on medication. I'm choosing not to go to hospital because I don't want to be on an insulin pump. Like I know how that deal goes. They usually will hook you up to, to a drip, and then you've got insulin being injected every couple of hours until they finally get you teetering back down to like a normal range. And then you're going to be on like metformin and insulin and slow acting and fast acting and all of that sort of stuff. And I didn't want to do that. And so I went, I need to make a radical decision. And in that radical decision, I decided to take responsibility for my own health and put my money where my mouth is and start eating my way out of this. And so I went into carnivore. And that was the first thing that I actually did to help resolve that. And then there are a couple of other things that I did. And so that's what this video is about. It's actually sharing, what are some of the extra things that you can do to help with blood glucose and rebalancing it? Now, not all of these I did in the sense of I maybe played with it for a little bit, but I haven't done it consistently. But they can be helpful. So some things have worked really well for me. Other things have worked really well for some of my clients as well. So not everything's going to work for everybody. Some of these are really universal, but not everything is going to work for everybody. So the key is to find the things that work for you, match them to the right individual, etc. And so with that in mind, number one, exercise. Exercise is one of the most amazing things that you can do to help lower your blood glucose, especially after eating. So if you eat a meal, the 30 minutes after eating that meal and increase your activity level is actually going to be really helpful for lowering your blood glucose levels. And so that exercise doesn't have to be super hard. It can be hard if you want it to be, but it doesn't have to be. It can be as simply as going for an afternoon walk after lunch. It can be as simple as, I'm just going to put a timer on and make sure that I don't sit down for 30 minutes after I've eaten. So I'm going to walk around the house. I'm going to do jobs for the next 30 minutes after eating to keep my energy up and to actually get a little bit of exercise in, which is going to actually help our muscles. So what's going to happen is our muscles are actually going to then use up that glucose. So then it doesn't get stored in and turned into fat, and it doesn't then also increase our blood glucose levels. It's also going to stimulate some insulin production as well. So movement is a big one in that. Number two is hydration. So one of the things that I see predominantly in people who have got diabetes is that they're often dehydrated. And one of the aspects is like when you've got diabetes, your blood tends to become a little bit thicker. And so adding some more hydration to that actually helps to thin that and change the viscosity of the actual blood and help it flow a little bit better. And so making sure that you are hydrated. Now, that could be in the form of adding a little bit of extra salt. So you might need to add in some electrolytes. You might need to make sure that you're drinking some water. So for me, and this is going to be Australian math, so you can certainly change it into whatever country you're from. But the general ratio from the nutrition perspective is 35 mils of water per kilo of weight. So if I was 100 kilos, then I would be drinking 3.5 liters of water. That would be a goal that I would be looking to try and get to. It doesn't mean that I get to it every day. Doesn't mean that, it's perfect. But that's kind of the goal that we're getting to, is that 3.5 liters for somebody who is 100 kilos. Now, at 100 kilos, that's approximately, it's a little bit over 200 pounds. It might actually be a little bit closer to 250 pounds. So around about that. And so certainly do the math on that and have a figure out, like, what are you currently drinking? How much water are you currently bringing in? Now, that doesn't count, like, it doesn't count if it's a cup of tea, and it doesn't count if it's coffee, because both of those are dehydrating beverages versus hydrating beverages. So think about it in terms of water or electrolyte water. And so hydration is a big one of those things, making sure that you've got enough hydration. Now, the other part of that is that for people who do have diabetes, one of the areas that tends to, or one of the organ areas that tends to get a little bit more taxed is the kidneys. And of course, the number one thing for the kidneys is hydration. They need plenty of water to be able to do that process of filtration without having too much come through in one go, so that the kidneys have got like a nice, consistent movement going through them, versus a big whammy of toxins because, like, we're not drinking enough water. And so the other side of that is that one of the methods in which we actually get rid of toxins from our body is through urination. And so if you don't have enough water, you're going to limit how much you're able to get through there in a nice way that's actually nice and gentle on the kidneys, versus, a big whammy of stuff. So hydration is one of those. Number 3, stress management. Now, this is a big one. It's something that I have learned for myself, especially over the last 2 years, because I've been monitoring my blood glucose for the last 2 years. And so one of the things that I have found for myself, and I've seen this in my clients as well, is that when I'm in a moment of stress, my blood glucose will naturally go up. And so that stress can be the kids have got a cold, and maybe I'm actually starting to get the cold. Doesn't mean it always manifests into a cold, but even the stress of, like, my body defending itself against that cold is going to add a little bit of extra stress to my body. Not having enough sleep, so lack of sleep, is going to increase stress. That's going to also then increase your blood glucose levels. So if you've got lots of disturbed sleep, you're not sleeping really well, maybe you've got some aches and pains. Maybe you actually need to go and have a chiropractic adjustment to help you with the aches and pains overnight. You might maybe need some omega-3 oils, like, some sardines, for example, that help with the inflammation that you might be having, that's, stopping you from sleeping as well. There's a whole bunch of different things that could be contributing to sleep, but lack of sleep is going to be one of those things that actually increases blood glucose levels. Having a fight, for example, like, all the big stresses of, like, losing somebody that you love, moving house, all of that type of stuff. Those are big stresses that are also going to increase your blood glucose. And so there'll be times on the journey where you're just going to have to go, yeah, this is what it is right now because of X, Y, and Z. But then there are some other amazing tools to help you. So when it comes to stress, plug into some of the tools that help you. Now, that might be going outside and laying in the sun. Like, I have some clients that have got adrenal fatigue, for example, and their goal for the day is to put a towel down if it's sunny enough, wear a bikini or limited clothes, and actually go and sunbake, because that's going to help to de-stress them. The other part of that could be earthing. So you might get an earthing mat. You might get an earthing sheet that you put on your bed that helps you de-stress from EMFs, electromagnetic frequencies that we're surrounded with. Like, I'm surrounded with it right now because I'm on a computer. So earthing mats could be a useful tool to help you with that de-stressing process. You could use things like tapping. You could use emotional release work. You could work with a therapist. You could do all sorts of different things to help you with like some of the physical stress that you have. Now, there can also be some environmental stress, which might be you're living in a house that's moldy, for example, that's going to increase your blood glucose. You're living in a house that's like really dusty, that's likely to increase your blood glucose because majority of us do have some form of dust allergy. You might have some food allergies. So, for example, even though you're eating carnivore, you might actually have some reactions to things like eggs or chicken. Those two tend to be the most prominent ones, but there could be some other ones. Like, let's say there's a seafood allergy that's playing around in the background. There could be a bunch of things that are from an environmental perspective. And the goal would be to like seek out what those things are and then reduce them. And you might need some blood testing to help you figure that out. You might need some hair testing to help you figure those things out as well. So number 4 on my list for helping you with diabetes is some supplements. Now, people who have diabetes tend to be super low in things like chromium. So taking some chromium can be helpful. Magnesium, because magnesium is going to reduce your stress. It's a calming nutrient. And so that's going to help with your stress. Cinnamon, turmeric, ginger, fenugreek, berberine, those are all good things that actually help to lower blood glucose as well and help your liver and your pancreas actually do a bit more of that balancing act. So those are some supplements that you can use. Now, I've used some of those from time to time. I'll use berberine, for example, for people who have been on, say, metformin and are wanting to come off of that. We'll switch them to berberine. And then the goal is actually to get them off of that as well. Like the goal is not to be taking those things forever. It is to use them as tools to help you get to that place of balance. So number 5 on my list is intermittent. That's 5, by the way there. I can't count. Number 5 is intermittent fasting. Now, when it comes to intermittent fasting, remember that my predominant audience is female. So I'm working mostly with females. And if they're skipping breakfast, it's often going to have an impact on their thyroid. Not always, but for a vast majority of them, it'll have an impact on their thyroid, which will slow down their metabolism, which will then mean that they're burning calories at a lower rate anyway. And so to help rev that up, the number one thing I'm going to tell them is have breakfast. So when it comes to intermittent fasting, the key there for, especially for a lot of women, less so for men, but especially for a lot of women, is to move that fasting window. So often what happens is that we wake up and we go, yeah, I could skip breakfast. And they might not have food until say 11, 12 or 1. And then they eat, but then they eat until like maybe, 9 o'clock at night, right? So they've just moved their eating window. Or they might cut that eating off a little bit. But by not having food and asking your body to actually do stuff, so get up and be active and attentive and all of that type of stuff, but there's no food, what you're doing is giving your body this subtle message that we're either in a famine or some type of crisis or a war. And so your body responds, your metabolism and your metabolic system responds to that by slowing it down, by slowing down your metabolic rate. Which then, of course, does not help when it comes to things like weight loss and hormone productions and all of that follow-on stuff that's actually happening. But the best bang for buck when it comes to intermittent fasting is to eat breakfast within the first hour of the day and cut your eating window shorter. So finish eating by about 5 or 4 even. And that longer break overnight actually gives you the most bang for buck when it comes to fasting. So you're getting the most benefit out of the effort that you're putting in. Plus, it doesn't stress your hormones like skipping breakfast and eating later in the day. So intermittent fasting can be helpful. Now, when it comes to fasting, I also want to say that a lot of people who have diabetes already have insulin resistance. So if you have insulin resistance, what's actually going to happen when you stop eating is that if you've had insulin resistance for a substantial amount of time, and if you've got diabetes, you probably had insulin resistance for a good 10 to 15 years before the diabetes actually manifested itself in your blood work. And so if that is the case for you, then what will happen for some people when they don't eat? So let's say you do, I'm going to do a 3-day water fast. This will happen more for women than it will for men. What will happen is instead of their blood glucose coming down, their blood glucose rises. And now the reason for that happens is because the insulin has been so used to being on at such a high level for such a long time that it continues to produce that same amount of insulin. And if you overproduce insulin and you don't eat enough to balance that insulin, that's when you go into a hypoglycemic event. So that's when it's called a hypo in the diabetes world, but basically it's hypoglycemia. and you can go into a coma from that. Now, your body has this protective mechanism, and the protective mechanism is that if it's recognizing that that's actually starting to happen for you and there's no carbohydrates around because you're not eating them, it's going to take some of the protein that you're eating. And if you're not eating protein because you're fasting completely, it's going to take some of the muscle, some of the protein off of your body and turn that into glucose. And that process is a protective one to stop you from going into hypoglycemia. And those people who have that experience, I'm absolutely one of them. If that's the experience for you, like when you are fasting, you're not getting better blood glucose results. In fact, you might actually see your blood glucose rise. What's happening is your body's entering into a stress response versus into that healing response that we're actually after. And so for a lot of people in the space of reversing diabetes, they actually have to do what's called a fed fast rather than a water fast. So a water fast is basically where you just drink water. You can do a dry fast, and a dry fast is when you don't have water or food. And then there are what's called fed fastings. Now, fed fastings are when we're limiting the food that we're actually having. So Lion's diet, for example, would be considered a fed fast. Beef and butter is a fed fast. Sardines, where you only eat sardines, for several days or longer. That's a fed fast. So it's where there's food coming in, so the body's not entering into that state of stress. There's calories coming in, so it's able to keep running and functioning and doing all the things that it needs to. But the particular foods that you are bringing in are actually starting to shut down insulin. So things like the sardine fast works really well for a lot of people simply because sardines have what are called medium chain triglycerides. And those medium chain triglycerides are able to enter into the liver via the portal vein and quickly be used by the mitochondria to actually create ketones. And those ketones then feed back to the insulin to shut the insulin down. So there's this big feedback loop that goes on and takes place in that scenario. And because they're medium chain triglycerides, they don't have to go through the normal processes that fats go through. So if you've got something that's a large chain triglyceride, saturated fat, for example, it has to go through a digestion process where we release bile. That bile breaks down that fat then is absorbed, and then we're able to use it. When it is a medium chain triglyceride, it actually goes straight to the portal vein and is able to quickly and easily be used by the mitochondria to actually create those ketones. And so that's why sardine fasts tend to work for a lot of people. They don't work for everybody. It might be beef and butter that works for you. It might be pork and butter that works for you. It might be a butter fast that works for you. It might be a fat fast that works for you. There is a whole bunch of different ones that can be helpful. And this is why I run the Quest. So, every couple of times a year, I'll run a program that's called the Quest. And during that program, we're going to test out all of these different fastings to see which one actually works well for you. And then we can implement that more frequently. And so when it comes to intermittent fasting, I tend to lean for diabetes more towards the fed fast than I do the water fasts. Okay, number 6 on my list is fats and proteins are great for stabilizing blood glucose, but you've got to have the key balance. So I personally have found for me that the balance comes more at around 80 to 85% fat and 15 to 20% protein. And that tends to be where I find my balance and my body functions best at this point in my journey. Now, that I say at this point in my journey because as I heal, that changes. And so it's about listening to your body, getting the feedback of like what's actually happening, what's actually working, and then starting to change it. Because as insulin comes down, you don't have to be as controlled with protein as when it is high. When insulin is really high, the more protein you have, the more likely you're going to turn that protein into glucose, and that whole cycle is going to happen. But in those early stages, having a much higher fat diet is actually going to help to turn down that insulin, turn the glucose down, and actually get you into the balance that you want. So you might need to play around with your fat to protein ratio a little bit to find the sweet spots that actually work really well for you. But I can say from experience that, especially in the early stages, it's around 80 to 85% fat that tends to work really well for most people when it comes to stabilizing blood glucose. Meal times. So we've talked about this a little bit within the intermittent fasting, but timing your meals can be really helpful in regards to supporting that. So what I find works best, and that's not for everyone. Remember this, everything needs to be tweaked and changed for every person individually. But what I find tends to work best for those people that do have blood glucose issues is starting with breakfast within the first hour of the day, and then having a nice second meal. So having 2 meals a day, but having a nice second meal somewhere around 3, 4, 5 in the afternoon. That tends to work best. Now, the key is that you're making sure that you're eating plenty of fat at both of those meals so that you're satiated and satisfied throughout the whole experience. But that's what tends to work best when you're timing those meals. Number 8 on my list is cold exposure. So if you need to get your blood glucose down because it's a bit high, or maybe you've had a cheeky thing that you know you shouldn't have had, and it's not really great for you, cold exposure tends to work really well. Now, that could be if it's cold outside, going outside and spending, 5-10 minutes, depending on how cold it is outside, right? Be wise and smart. Spending that time outside and getting a little bit of cold exposure can actually help, because it's going to make you burn more calories, which is going to make you chew through that glucose a little bit faster. It's also going to make your muscles absorb more of that glucose as well. You could have a cold shower. A cold shower for, turning it on for short bursts of cold actually also does that same process of actually helping you use up more of that glucose. You could jump into a cold river and go for a swim, or in a pool. You could do a cold plunge. All of those actually help to reset the metabolic system and help you to use up some of that excess glucose that may be hanging around. Number 9 on my list is apple cider vinegar. This one is super easy. You could put 20 mils of apple cider vinegar into a glass of water and drink that with your meal or after your meal. But that the glycolic acid that's actually in that apple cider vinegar helps to stimulate the liver, helps it to break down fats, helps it to do all sorts of other amazing things. One of those amazing things in particular is helping to stabilize blood glucose. So that's a really simple, easy one that you can do. Now, there are some apple cider vinegar capsules on the market. They don't work as well as actually putting it into some water and drinking it. Now, one of the methods I found that was quite helpful was to put it into some soda water. So putting your apple cider vinegar into soda water kind of has a little bit less of that tart sort of experience than if it's in just plain water. But you do you. Whatever works for you, you do you. And number 10 is brush your teeth after meals. Like when you brush your teeth after meals, you are halting the digestion process in the mouth. So you're stopping the reabsorption. So if you've got food particles that are still around your mouth, what you're doing is prolonging the absorption, or the time in which you're absorbing food through like your gums, etc. And so brushing your teeth after a meal does a number of different things. It signals to your body that the meal is over. There's like a mental connection there that the meal is over. But the other thing is you're removing the food sources. There might be extra protein that's hanging around in your mouth. You're removing that so you're not continuing to prolong how long you're going to be absorbing that for. And so that's a really simple thing that you can do as well. So quick recap. Here's my 10 things that you can add on to something like Carnivore to help you with things like diabetes. 1, exercise. 10, 20, 30 minutes after you've actually eaten. Put on an alarm. Just don't sit down for the 10, 20 minutes after eating or 30 minutes after eating. The longer you stay moving, the better the outcomes are. 2, check your hydration. Make sure you're drinking enough water, that you've got enough electrolytes, and so on. The one thing that I'll add to that is that when it comes to electrolytes, when your body is switching from being a carb burner into a ketone burner, you may find that you are really lacking in some of those electrolytes. So make sure you stay on top of those. Stress management, deep breathing, looking at all the areas of where you've got some stress coming in, whether it be food allergies, household allergies, whether it be, you're in relationships that are toxic, whether it be you're around electromagnetic frequencies all of the time, and rebalancing those things. So figure out the stress stuff. Number 4, there's some supplements that can be quite helpful in that process. Number 5, intermittent fasting or fed fasting. 6, balancing fats and proteins. 7, meal timing. 8, cold exposure. 9, apple cider vinegar. And number 10, brushing your teeth after you eat. All right, that's it for me today. I hope you have the most amazing day ever. If you have any questions or comments, remember to like and subscribe. pop your comments into the box below, and I will happily come back and answer those when I see them. All right, bye for now. Hope you have an amazing day. See you later.